what happens in the Middle East in the coming weeks could have an impact on the Red Sea.
It's definitely not on the front of your mind at the moment. That there are bigger things now happening, that actually getting container shipping back into the Red Sea is not the priority. But I think if you're looking at it from the perspective of when will shipping return, and more so what will it require, then maybe we're on an accelerated path now because it has blown up.
Welcome to The Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistics leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. In our latest episode, it's myself, Phil Hennessey, and Zenetta Senior Shipping Analyst, Emily Stausbøll. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Phil. Ready to go for another week? Plenty of new stuff to cover again.
It's incredible, isn't it? So, yeah, I mean, where we talk about what really keeps the world moving, appropriate intro for this episode of The Freight Debate, because we're going to talk about, well, two things really. We're going to talk about the trade flows of container shipping around the world, how that's been kind of pushed and pulled in different directions as a result of tariffs and geopolitical factors. And then we will touch upon the ongoing issues in the Middle East. We're kind of, as we record it now, for the benefit of listeners and viewers, we're at a point where it's escalating quite worryingly. But we will try and steer away from trying to predict what happens in a geopolitical sense and concentrate more on the potential impacts on supply chains and container shipping. So, best place to start then, Emily. Another interesting time in tariffs, but we have some more data, do we not? Which gives us a bit of an indication of how things are shaping up in terms of container shipping demand so far in 2025.
We had some quite strong demand data really in April, almost up sort of 13% now. If you look at the first 4 months of the year, it's the first time there's ever been 60 million TEU moved in the first 4 months of the year. So that's kind of setting out a record-setting pace. But clearly with some downsides, and obviously the significant one there is China to the US, because let's just put it in context. When we talk about April demand data, that's being measured, and we get that from container trade statistics. They measure it from the time of export. So in April, what are they looking at? They're looking at the number of containers being moved out of China. And that's obviously, we had Liberation Day, 2nd of April. So already in April, there was a significant downturn in those exports out of China. We spent a lot of time talking about it, but now we're also seeing the data on that side. But I think interestingly enough that really, if you look away from that particular trade, which is significantly down, I think it's 25% down from April last year, which is a really big deal and obviously important for all the carriers. But on many of the other trades, there's growth, and that both when it comes into North American or US imports in particular, they're seeing higher imports from the rest of the world. And also China is exporting more to other regions to make up for a lot of the shortfall, not all of it, but a lot of the shortfall that they're experiencing into the US.
But it's interesting though, isn't it? Because I think we've talked about it on previous episodes of the Freight Debate, saying shippers have basically put the brakes on. They're not shipping anything because the 145% tariffs came in, and there's been a huge dip in demand. And then you come along today and say, actually, global container shipping demand is it record levels? We do record, isn't it?
Is it the record for the sort of first 4 months of the year, and very high for April? Yeah.
Yeah. So it just goes to show, doesn't it? I think that what you read in the media, what you maybe read on LinkedIn around dropping demand or what shippers are doing or not doing, the data can actually not tell a different story, because it's true, there was a drop in demand.
Yep.
But actually the data tells a bigger story, doesn't it, at a global level?
But I think also it's interesting because some of the data also indicates some stuff happening sort of under the table. So if you look at Chinese exports to the US, down about 25%, to North America generally down 20%. So they have
And
managed to export more to Mexico and Canada, but obviously still far down. But to the rest of the world, they've exported more. Intra Far East, which is the biggest volume trade in the world, China exported 25% more than a year ago. Now, a lot of that will be sort of genuine exports, so to say, but there will also be an element of, okay, well, let's transship it through somewhere. And
yeah,
same goes 25% growth into South and Central America. Of course, there's that demand there and growing demand, but China is looking for alternatives, both for other markets, but also there are some looking to get those goods in via a different way. And that's complicated when we have all these other tariffs because the rest of the world is also not tariff free. And we'll get into that, I think, because we are starting to approach that 9th of July deadline, and kind of the outlook for what happens after that.
yeah. And just to kind of the benefit of, maybe some listeners that aren't following exactly what we're saying here, um, when the 100 foot, for example, when the 145% tariffs were against, Chinese imports into US, what we're saying is that there was a bit of a maybe game of compliance to be played if you can ship goods into, well, anywhere else. I mean, maybe we're talking, inter-Asia here, aren't we? But actually, anywhere else with South America, or if you can demonstrate the origin of those goods isn't China, then you can avoid the tariffs. But it's a big hassle, isn't it? It's a big hassle.
Yeah, and
You look.
I think the two of us should be careful. We're not customs experts, and I think you can get into a bit of a discussion about how easy it is really to game the system and whether you can actually save money with it or if it's just going to cause you more bother down the road. But to me, 25% growth to the rest of the Far East and to South and Central America would suggest there is some of that going on, and partly it would also be the front loading
Mm,
when we go into the US as well. But it's kind of a mix of stuff, and not one thing is the full reason behind it. So we can look a bit more detailed at the different reasons behind it.
yeah, but we've said it before, haven't we? If you slap 145% tariffs on China imports into the US, first of all, China aren't just gonna sit on their hands, are they? And just kind of do nothing. They're gonna take kind of action to try and, whether it's, support, Chinese businesses to find new markets, or still maintain markets in the US. And likewise, shippers are gonna try and find ways to maintain their business, aren't they?
And we've heard
So
from a few of our customers about saying, okay, the stuff we produce in China, we might used to have sent 50% to the US and 50% to Europe. Now we send it all to Europe, and then the factory we have maybe in India or Vietnam, that is now getting 100% to the US. And the April data for Chinese exports to Europe is also 9% growth, and that's also a substantial growth when you look at kind of the underlying macroeconomic data behind it. So there's a lot
sure.
of changes going on, and let's just we obviously don't know exactly what the data will show going forward, but let's just put it in, give us an idea, because I think we're looking at a May that will be better than April when it comes to Chinese exports to the US, because you did have around the middle of the month you had that pause, and suddenly this big incentive to front load. So May presumably will be up. The first half will be poor, but as soon as you got that delay, people will be moving as fast as they can, and then June and July presumably also strong. After which it kind of collapses, or certainly falls back to where it was in April, if not even lower. And there again, we've had a little bit of noise around the US China deal and talk of 55% tariffs, which would seem to be the 30% in place now plus the 25% from the first trade war. So, but I think it's still unclear, and we have nothing on paper yet.
But
So,
does
so
it
it'll
matter?
definitely be interesting to watch.
I
But
mean, does it matter? In other words, what if it's coming down from 145%? So when it was 145%, a lot of shippers just put the anchor down, literally, and stopped shipping into the US. Now we've got this 90-day pause in those higher tariffs, and they're shipping goods again. Now, whether the tariffs go you know, up to 145% again, or they go back down to zero, these shippers have already front loaded goods, haven't they? They've built up inventory. So kind of, does it matter what, no, it doesn't matter. I think people listening say, yes, it does matter what tariffs do. But in terms of demand,
there's an
when the
element those goods have been moved.
Yeah, it has to
Yeah.
yeah, it has to ease, doesn't it? It's
Yes.
because unless there's a huge spike in consumer demand in the US, which doesn't seem likely given, the kind of economic but, the kind of underlying economic, situation. So, irrespective of what happens at the end of the 90 days, demand is gonna have to fall, and I suppose, follow on from that, if you're a carrier, that's probably a little worrying, isn't it?
Yeah. No, and I'm starting to think a little bit, if you're sitting in the US, are you still as scared as you were on the 3rd of April that this 145 is what it, or have you seen what's happened in the past, what, 8 weeks now, and thought actually it's probably not as bad as it could have been or as it was first announced, and take the pressure off a little bit on that. 30% is still not great, but 30% you can import with. 145 is a different ballgame. And I think to a certain extent, we're starting to see that in the spot rates. If you look from China to the US West Coast in particular, those mid-month GRIs haven't really worked, and actually rates now are lower than they were back on the 1st of June, as those kind of rate increases on the first of the month kind of failed to fully stick, and certainly the
Yeah.
ones that carriers tried to push in the 15th, they haven't stuck at all. So we're back down. I mean, down. We're still about $5,000, but it's not the upward pressure that might otherwise have been.
Yeah, we always have to caveat down, don't we? Because we're not the ones paying the, paying the money, so I think, again, listeners, please, they're not down, they're just not as high as they were. So, yeah, we've, for again, if people want to get, kind of regular updates, we publish it's a weekly market update. Um, and since the 90-day pause in tariffs came into effect and we saw that spike in demand and therefore the spike in spot rates, particularly into US West Coast, um, yourself and Peter Sand, our chief analyst, have been saying it's going to peak kind of mid-June, end of June, and then start to come down. And it is what we're seeing because, you know, this is a temporary rush of cargo, isn't it? It cannot, it can't be sustained, can it?
No, and I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that the 90-day pause from everywhere but China, that deadline is approaching very, very fast. And of course, there are some shorter transit times to get into the US East Coast, but that pressure is also coming off as you kind of see that sort of front loading there starting to ease off, which of course helps even on the China trades to ease the pressure there as well.
Yeah. But spot rates into Europe from Far East aren't falling in the same way to West Coast. Am I right? US West
No,
Coast?
they're still increasing.
Yeah.
And in part, that will be, I mean, 9% demand growth in April is strong. I would expect that demand to kind of keep maybe slightly lower, but still strong demand. But that's the effect. That's kind of what makes shipping this global thing. If you have pressure on one trade and rates are going up there, carriers will move their ships to that trade. And I think in the
Yeah.
past we might have seen that happen and then the effect. Whereas like you get the impression now that kind of everybody knows that's what happened. So capacity is still there. It's not like they've announced huge blank sailings, but a little bit an attitude of, okay, we know what the alternative is. So if they're pushing
Yeah.
them up, we want to make sure our stuff still gets shipped. So
Yeah.
the rates there have taken another jump up on the 15th of the month.
At the risk of kind of offending any kind of US listeners or viewers, there is more to the world than the front holes into the US, isn't there? We the, it's all part of the same melting pot of push and pull and global supply
But
and
I would
demand.
almost take that the other way. Rather than saying the US isn't relevant, the US, what's happening in the US is having a direct impact on non-US trades.
You just
Is
want
that
that
not?
north. Yeah.
I'm just more friendly towards our American.
Yeah, no, but I suppose it's two sides of the same coin, isn't it? One thing doesn't happen in isolation, and we've seen this, haven't we? Why should when we had the escalation in the Red Sea and the diversions around the Cape of Good Hope? Well, why should rates into the US West Coast increase? Because they don't transit. Do you see what I know
Yeah,
why they
no,
do,
totally, totally.
but if
Or the
operationally, it's
transatlantic for that matter. It's all
all
the
the
same thing.
yeah,
Nothing is really isolated in container shipping,
for sure.
especially when there's so little slack in the system. If there was a whole load of ships that were just unemployed and doing nothing, then you can have one thing happen there and it doesn't really make a difference. But at the moment, when we're running on such sort of a tight slack, then you can't avoid having those knock on effects.
Yeah, yeah. But it's intelligence that, if you're buying freight now, you kinda need to know. If you see a spot rate still elevated, um, and you see ongoing tariff disruption reported in the media and people still saying, "Oh God, what do we do? What do we do?" All this uncertainty and fear and, is there a squeeze on capacity? Um, that generates potentially somebody saying, if they wanted to agree a long-term contract now,
Yeah.
a higher long-term contract for the next 12 months, when in actual fact, what we've just discussed for the last 15 minutes is that, I mean, don't kind of hold don't come to us if the markets don't go the way you want. What we've just discussed for the last 15 minutes is actually the underlying market dynamics, the market forces would suggest an easing in demand and an easing in that squeeze on capacity and therefore, downward pressure on rates. Because we saw the downward pressure on rates in Q1, didn't we? This isn't,
It started in Q1, and I would go even further back. We saw it in at the end of 2023. But ever since then, and the end of 2023, the kind of fundamentals, supply growth, so the fleet hugely expanded, demand growth by no means following the same rate, we're allowed to kind of let rates go to the levels they did. And ever since then, there's kind of been stuff happening that means that actually the fundamentals haven't been the most important factor at play. And kind of the tariffs have been that next thing. But we're looking now towards an end point for that. If we say, if everything goes like we think it's going today, that come kind of the end of July, that really drops out and actually demand falls even further than we would otherwise expect. And then you get back to those fundamentals, and the fundamentals are in a shipper's favor, saying this is an easier market to procure freight by if things remain like they are today, which is a big if these days.
well, yeah, it's an unlikely, isn't it? I think rather than if at the moment. Um, so looking to the rest of 2025 then, um, if you are a shipper, what do you do? If you think, I don't wanna keep procuring freight on the spot market, it's time consuming and it's not really what we want to be doing. What do you do? It's not, where do you go from this point?
I would still see it as two very different things. One thing is, okay, what you need to move in response to the tariff, and then something else is how your business is going to run for the next 6 to 12 months. And you should be approaching those two things separately, because on one hand, okay, if you need to beat those deadlines, then you do need the spot market, and you might have to pay $5,000 and more obviously into the East Coast, but that's worth it. But look beyond that and say, okay, if I had a long-term contract 1st of May, maybe I couldn't move all these extra volumes on it, but I can still do my MQCs on it and move it that way. So to me, it's really a split between, okay, here and now and your direct sort of knock-on effects of tariff from what you're doing. And that's often not the person who procures freight. They'll get a call from somewhere in the company saying, this is what we've decided to do. Can you make sure the goods move? And then on the
Yeah,
other side say, okay, this is how our business is set up to work, and this is the kind of the way we want to do it going forward, and
yeah,
not to get locked in for too long based on the situation today.
yeah. And just to wrap that up, especially if you're a shipper on trade the kind of non-US trades, as we talked about, it affects everyone, doesn't it? Let's say you're, on the transatlantic, well, not transatlantic, on Far East to North Europe, um, who, though that could in fact, well, could it go the other way then? Let's talk about so as carriers are shifting capacity back onto the Trans-Pacific off the trades from Far East to North Europe, as well as we've seen, the rates aren't going down as quickly, are they? So again, if you're looking at a long-term contract on that trade, you've just got different considerations and different conversations with the carrier, haven't you? How it's just a completely different negotiation, position.
Yeah. But still with an eye to what's happening in the US and these kind of two different realities, one today and one past tariff. And I don't know what past tariff looks like anymore, but it must be there somewhere. Not that
Yeah,
the tariffs will disappear, but that we find kind of, okay, this is now the tariff level we have to deal with. Because I think the major issue is, okay, it's a tariff, but it's also just having absolutely no idea what happens. And we talked briefly about the US China deal, but 9th of July is quite close, and it seems the only real deal we have is with the UK, which is basically not changing what they got on Liberation Day because they had 10%, and then some better deals on the automobile and steel and aluminium. But
Yeah,
everywhere else, and certainly the bigger exporters to the US are still left wondering.
yeah. It was that good of a deal, they dropped it on the floor. And and Keir Starmer picked it up, which is very British, very polite. Um, okay, there we go. Demand, bit of a roller coaster.
Yep.
Um,
And one that hasn't ended yet.
s Similarly, another that hasn't ended yet. Yeah, yeah, that hasn't ended yet. I do there'll be people, kind of listening to this, shipping to Australia or, Far East to Canada or, exports out of US. It's a crazy situation, isn't it? And, we touched on it before. Go go
There that on those major front hauls, they impact everything else. It's maybe a different story if you're on a backhaul trade, and it goes back a little bit to what we saw during the Red Sea. We saw that upwards pressure on the front haul trades, and that kind of spread everywhere else. But the backhauls not so much, which was in a big contrast to the pandemic, where actually there was a lot of pressure on the backhauls. In the first months of the pandemic, it was more expensive to send a container from North Europe to the Far East than the other way around. And we did see those spikes, whereas or the past year and a half now, backhaul rates have been very low and in some cases record low. So yes, on the front hauls, there's one reality and everything kind of pushes down. But it's also important that actually you know what trade you're on. Is this a trade where you're the front haul, back haul? What's the capacity like? And all those things also play in. So it's not just one answer fits all.
Yeah. Well, it's not one answer fits all, but if you want to have some answers, and keep on top of the market movements, as I say, just to kind of, um, push this, with Zanetta, we do publish on our website a weekly market update. So that's gonna be really interesting over the next few weeks, isn't it, to see, how those, spot rates develop on those front haul trades. We also have a Ocean Outlook 2025 mid-year update we told you about in the last Freight Debate, episode, which is available to download from our website, and it covers all geopolitical factors and demand, supply, rates, environmental
Buzzwords.
everything. Yeah, it is a view of the whole industry as it stands now, which leads us nicely onto the second part of this episode, because one of the other topics covered in the Zanetta Ocean Outlook 2025 is the Red Sea. As we trailed at the start of this episode, there's been, a really serious escalation, hasn't there, in the Middle East, between Israel and Iran. Difficult for us to really kind of comment too much on it because it's breaking news as we sit here now. So we're not going to try and give a view, and we would never give a view in a political sense, but we can, I think, give some um, insight on the potential impact of this. And there's two areas that I think we should be covering here. There's the local, maybe for want of a better word, local impact, i.e., Strait of Hormuz, Arabian Gulf, and also the knock-on impact that it could possibly have on the Red Sea. And there's two very different ways of looking at this, because if we concentrate on the kind of local impact, with the Strait of Hormuz and as the kind of gateway to Jebel Ali port and such like, um, let's make a let's have a differentiate here that actually just because something is a major global event of enormous global significance, it doesn't actually mean that it has a major impact on supply chains, does it? So, what has there been this escalation of war in the Middle East? How are we seeing that?
So I mean, it's clear that the impact at the moment is relatively limited compared to what it could be. So if we just start with kind of where we are right now, We've seen carriers announce new surcharges into the region, out of the region on services that are directly affected. We've seen a couple of carriers on certain services announce that they will stop calling at certain ports in the area. But that's kind of the extent of it at the moment as we speak, purely on container shipping. The other side then is, okay, what is happening in the region? Now, obviously, the strait is hugely important for oil transport. About a third of oil that gets moved by sea goes through that strait. And we've seen kind of the oil price go up, and that obviously affects bunker prices, which should make their way into higher rates for shippers with the bunker adjustments. And I think also we're seeing reports out of the region of electronic interference, and that's sort of kind of communications equipment, it's your GPS signal. And we've seen that before in regions where tensions start hotting up. It's not new in that sense. But that also makes transit through the area more dangerous, even if you assume that actually the ship is not going to be directly targeted. If you've got a whole load of ships sailing through a relatively narrow strait, and half of them, or a few of them even, don't have the communication they need, then you're clearly at risk. There's been a lot of talk in the past months about the shadow fleet, which is kind of the similar idea of these old tanker ships that sail around in ghost mode because they're transporting sanctioned oil. And that's what they do. But then every now and then they meet a ship that is fully operational and has all the equipment running, and it ends badly. So clearly that's also an increased risk from carriers at this stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
But obviously the situation deteriorates. I think the region for container shipping itself is relatively small. It's 2 or 3% of global container volumes that are targeted there. So it's not huge, but it's clear that it's another. We were talking about slack in the system before. It's one of these new things that gets added, and if you get some ships stuck here and there, and carriers needing to figure out, okay, how do I get volumes in there, especially with all the stuff we've got going on a little bit further to the west in the Red Sea, it just
Yeah.
complicates the picture even further.
As one of the risks here has to be, given the volatility of the situation, is that it takes time to go through Strait of Hormuz, call it Jebel Ali or Abu Dhabi and whatever port calls you've got. If the situation deteriorates rapidly, which it very well could do, you've got a ship in a dead end
Yeah.
effectively,
Yeah.
and can't get out. That's a
No, because you had the same situation with the Red Sea in those first few weeks, but you could kind of turn around and sail back through the canal or go the other way. But here, it is really a dead end, and that ship
yeah,
is stuck for the foreseeable future. So
yeah.
it's definitely one to watch, and I think at the moment relatively limited impact, but it can clearly have those much bigger consequences if that boils up further.
So if we look at purely from a freight rate point of view, um, what's going to be the drivers if we do see the spikes? Presumably, if oil prices increase, then there could be a knock-on
Yeah, so that would
effect there.
increase freight rates everywhere. And
Yeah,
then clearly you also have sort of higher insurance premiums, and carriers will want to pass those on directly on those trades, and that's where we've seen surcharges of somewhere between $500 and $1,500 as far as I've seen so far, being added on trades directly in or out of the region.
yeah. So that's the kind of local view, the kind of local impact. And as we say, it's interesting from a purely kind of analytical point of view. That we've seen this before when we have a major event. Baltimore Bridge collapse was a hugely shocking event, but from a container shipping point of view, not as impactful as many people from the outside of industry looking in would have thought. Um, but then we look at other geopolitical situations, or actually not even political situation. Look at Ever Given getting stuck in, uh, you colossal impact, wasn't it?
Yeah.
A ship running around. So it just shows, doesn't it?
And
The
not a problem outside of container shipping directly. I mean, it went out everywhere because it was quite a I don't know, a fun picture or a sort of strange situation to
bizarre,
be in. But that was
rare,
purely
yeah,
on container. Yeah, it was purely on container shipping. So just because one thing has major importance sort of globally or for container shipping doesn't mean that translates into the other.
yeah.
But it
So
might. I think that's the key thing at the moment. But it could escalate
exactly,
and change things.
exactly. And let's turn focus to the Red Sea to round this episode off and this topic off, because that is one situation which has had, is having, and probably is going to continue having a massive impact on container shipping. And again, for anyone listening that isn't kind of fully up to speed with the kind of the knock-on
Ins and
ripple
outs of
effect.
container shipping.
Yeah, yes. Why would you be listening if you didn't?
How dare you?
Um,
Yeah.
how dare you not know? They must know now. There's been about
No, how
5
dare you
episodes.
suggest that they don't know?
No, I know, I know. Especially me. If anyone, no, I'm the last person to make that accusation. Um, for myself then, I'll explain this further. What we've got happening, the kind of the ongoing conflict in the Middle East between Israel, Hamas, and kind of by proxy, I suppose, Iran, who are supporting the Houthi militia in Yemen, and it's the Houthi militia that are effectively making this Red Sea out of bounds, Gulf of Aden out of bounds, and transiting the Suez Canal because of attacking merchant vessels. So, what happens in the Middle East in the coming weeks could have an impact on the Red Sea. Now, would we be right in saying that it makes the dramatic escalation in the Middle East makes a return to the Red Sea less likely?
I think, I mean, again, we're not geopolitical experts or anything, but if you just look at it, it's definitely not on the front of your mind at the moment. That there are bigger things now happening, that actually getting container shipping back into the Red Sea is not the priority. And that's clear, and that will continue. But I think if you're looking at it from the perspective of when will shipping return, and more so, what will it require, then maybe we're on an accelerated path now because it has blown up. So
Yeah.
if, we have no idea what happens, and I think with the White House at the moment, you have no idea really where this
No.
ends. But if it does end somewhere and really blow up, then maybe actually, okay, that it
Yeah.
makes it possible further down the line. But
Of
for
course.
here, right now, it's just not a conversation anymore.
No, absolutely. But obviously, as we say, we don't want there to be an escalation in conflict. From a purely human level.
Humans way,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah. Um, but clearly, there's a good likelihood that that is what's going to happen, and it's clear that maybe the only way that the issue in the Red Sea was going to be resolved was through
Something bigger.
this something bigger that actually kind of made the situation resolve itself in a albeit really kind of unpalatable, shocking way. Um, so just very quickly, to final word on this, just to give we have talked about this before, just to give an idea of the ongoing impact of Red Sea. Um, just can you give any indication of just how much capacity it's still swallowing from global container shipping and why it's still having such an impact on rates?
I think, I mean, it's clearly helped by demand at the moment. That there is such high demand means that those diversions mean a lot. If we get to a situation kind of post this summer where demand falls, then the Red Sea has slightly less impact because suddenly there is an overcapacity even with the Red Sea. But it's
Yeah,
clear that the Red Sea is really, of course, tariffs are causing the spikes at the moment. But without those diversions, rates would be at a completely different level, and we wouldn't see that same drive up in rates. So Red Sea is kind of key to keeping those freight rates up. But it's not enough when, rather than if we see a drop into the US, um, it will maybe hold it up from falling to rock bottom, but it will still fall. And we'll have to see the fleet adjusted to that. But I
yeah,
think at this point, that's not a. I think we talked in the mid-year outlook. We were looking at if you had a full return in the second half of the year, the transport work for container ships today would fall by about 5%. That's doesn't. I mean, definitely we won't have a full return in 12 days from now. But I think that has been pushed out further, unless it really escalates and something goes out of it. But it is still keeping rates up, and
yeah.
that's quite clear.
Okay, thanks, Emily. And that actually is probably quite a nice way to bring this episode to a conclusion because we've come full circle, haven't we? Where we started the episode talking about demand and rising and falling demand in the wake of rising and falling tariffs. But what we've just kind of came to as well is the demand of other geopolitical, the impact of not necessarily demand, but how that demand is absorbed by or used by capacity and the impact of the Red Sea crisis. So again, when we talked about is it about US or is it about the rest of the world? It's about both.
Yeah, in
It's not.
container shipping, it's never one or the other.
It's never one or the other. So, again, we can talk about rise and fall in demand because of tariffs. Well, maybe the umbrella across all of that in terms of how freight rates are going to develop is the Red Sea. Right, another interesting episode, Emily.
Very interesting episode. Let's see where we are in 2 weeks.
We will. So if you enjoyed this episode with myself and Emily, please hit subscribe. We'll see you on the next installment of the Freight Debate in a couple of weeks' time, when no doubt there's going to be more developments for us to talk about. But until then, thank you for myself. And thank you, Emily, for your.
And thank you from me for doing the thank you round.
Yeah, it's goodbye from me. It's goodbye from you.
Very good.
Thank you. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Freight Debate.